In 1957, Kenneth Anderson, a British hunter living in India, received a postcard from a friend asking for a strange request. The postcard had come from a small Muslim shrine located 105 miles outside of Bangalore in Mysore state. Kenneth's pulse quickened as he read the small lettering, smudged in places from the marks of dried tears. The card had been sent by a friend, Alam Bucks, who Kenneth had met entirely by accident. While traveling through India, Kenneth's car had broken down right outside the shrine. Even though he was quite elderly even at the time, Alam rushed to help. After that chance meeting, Kenneth made it a point to visit Alam and his family whenever he passed by the shrine, and he kept in touch with him whenever he could. This postcard was different though. Cramming as many words into the small space on the back as he could, Alam explained that his 22-year-old son had been attacked by a bear, and he begged Kenneth to come and kill it before it could hurt the rest of Alam's family. The request made Kenneth's heart ache with sympathy. It was unusual to be sure, but not perhaps surprising. You see, Kenneth Anderson had a touch of the wild about him. His family had already been living in India for generations, and it was in the wild Indian jungles where Kenneth actually felt the most at home. He was in fact a renowned big game hunter, but he also took unarmed trips out into the jungle to meditate and reconnect with nature, or to write in a journal in which he kept detailed descriptions of his days and adventures. Kenneth stuffed the postcard in his pocket and set his jaw. He may not know exactly what this trip would entail, but he knew one thing: his friend was in trouble and he needed to act fast. It wasn't until Kenneth had made the long journey to his friend's house that he would hear the full story. Alam and his family had been having dinner only a few nights before. There had been nothing unusual about that evening, no strange sounds or glimpses of shadow. So when Alam's son stepped outside for just a moment, no one thought twice, but everything changed in an instant. The lush fig trees surrounding the house were a haven for all sorts of wildlife, including bats, foxes, and other indigenous animals. It wasn't uncommon to see a variety of creatures feasting on the ripe fruit, either fallen to the ground or still clinging to the branches. However, it was highly unusual to encounter a sloth bear, a species that primarily subsists on plants and is generally timid around humans. But this particular sloth bear was different. Drawn by the abundance of figs, it was startled by Alam's son and launched a ferocious attack. Going for the face, a common target for bears, the beast missed its mark and instead bit into Alam's son's neck. The young man managed to break free, but the bear was not finished. It lunged at him again, biting and clawing at his face and stomach before disappearing into the darkness. The attack happened so quickly that Alam and the rest of the family had no chance to intervene or come to their son's aid. The young man stumbled back to the hut, covered in blood and gravely injured. His family frantically tried to stop the bleeding, but to no avail. The bear's bite had severed the young man's jugular vein, leaving him with little chance of survival. They stayed up with him all night, replacing cloth after cloth as they tried to stem the flow of blood, but he passed away just before dawn. The loss of their son left the family in a state of grief and vulnerability, with no means to protect themselves from another attack. Desperate and out of options, Alam sent a postcard to his friend Kenneth, hoping he would be able to help them. It had taken a few days for the card to reach Kenneth and for him to arrive, and now the question on everyone's mind was, would the bear attack again? Determined to take down the beast that had attacked Alam's son, Kenneth set off with just his handgun, a handful of ammunition, a flashlight, and a change of clothes. He waited until late at night when bears are typically most active, and then set out into the jungle. By this time in his life, Kenneth had already shot and killed several man-eating tigers and panthers, and he reasoned that a lumbering bear should pose much less of a challenge than a stealthy cat. Now, in the thick darkness of the jungle, Kenneth attached a flashlight to the end of his rifle and began to search. First, he searched the fig trees where the attack had occurred, but found nothing. Using only the single beam of his flashlight to guide him, he methodically trudged through the dense brush for hours. But by the time dawn had broken, he had yet to find any trace of the bear. Defeated, he returned to the hut and broke the bad news to Alam and his family, who then begged him to not give up. Of course, Kenneth agreed. This time, however, he waited until about midday, when he knew that the bear should be asleep, and then followed Alam up into the hills to a cave that he believed the bear might be using as a den. As they approached the cave, the eerie silence set off alarm bells in Kenneth's head. He tossed a few stones into the cave, hoping to rouse the bear if it was inside, but there was no movement or sound. The bear was gone. This wasn't the news that Alam and his family had been hoping for, but it at least meant that the bear had most likely moved on and would leave them alone. Or so they hoped. Eventually, Kenneth had to return home, but he left a lamb with some money in case he saw the bear again and needed to send a telegram rather than a postcard. But just 1 month after the attack on a lamb's son, Kenneth received a call from the district forest officer of another nearby town. Another sloth bear had mauled 2 woodcutters, and the officer asked for his help in eliminating the threat. Kenneth set out again, this time better prepared for a potentially more difficult hunt. But by the time he had arrived in the forest, the bear had already attacked a forest guard. Once again, alarm bells went off in Kenneth's head. Was this the same bear who had attacked a lamb's family? And if so, would it attack yet again? Kenneth wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. He had no sooner finished setting up base in the forest when another man came rushing in, explaining through ragged breath that his brother had just been attacked by a bear. The man begged for help and offered to lead Kenneth and a team of rescuers to him, and so they went, trudging deep into the jungle. Eventually, they came to the base of what appeared to Kenneth to be a normal hill. But it was here that the man and the rest of the team refused to go any further. Undeterred, Kenneth pressed forward, walking through the jungle and calling for the man's brother, whose name was Thima, just hoping for an answer. He'd almost given up when he heard someone moaning at the bottom of a ridge. He scrambled toward the sound and eventually spotted what appeared to be a crumpled body lying on the jungle floor. Drawing closer, Kenneth knew for sure that he'd found Thima. The man was covered in blood, and his face was almost completely bitten off. Kenneth knew that if he didn't get him to safety soon, Thima would stand no chance of surviving the night. And so Kenneth lent the man his rifle to use as a crutch and draped his other arm over his shoulders. Once again, Kenneth looked into the thick jungle and set his jaw. The trip back would not be easy. Taking one step at a time, the men struggled to keep their footing in the ever-darkening jungle. Worse, every snap of a twig and movement caught out of the corner of their eyes could be the bear returning to finish the job. Eventually, though, they made it back to where the group had stopped. The men, however, were nowhere to be found. Kenneth called out, but received no response. It was then that Kenneth lost his footing. Both he and Thima fell down a steep ridge that neither had noticed, rolling head over heels, completely out of control. As their bodies came to a stop, Kenneth's ankle wedged between 2 large rocks. He caught his breath and tried to rise. Waves of pain rolled up his leg, and he had to stifle a cry. His ankle was certainly sprained, if not outright broken. Fortunately, Thima had landed close by, though in their current states, neither man could move. The only thing they could do was sit there and hope that a rescue team would come for them before the bear did. But Thima was in bad shape. He lay in a restless stupor and moaned repeatedly. By dawn, Kenneth listened helplessly as the moans devolved into choked gurgles. Eventually, these stopped too. Now, Kenneth was completely alone. Eventually, a rescue team did arrive, but of course, it was too late for Thima. Kenneth was taken to a hospital where he underwent treatment for his leg. He was released over a week later, more determined than ever to catch this bear. Astoundingly, he discovered that during his time in the hospital, 2 more men had been brutally mauled by a bear that matched the description of the same one he'd been hunting for. Worse, he was told that the bear was now regularly seen in a certain part of the forest about a mile away from a nearby village. This wasn't good, but at least now he had a heading. Kenneth did things differently this time. Instead of chasing the bear, which always seemed to be a step ahead, he decided to make the bear come to him. He picked a spot near an area where the bear had been recently sighted at the base of the biggest fruit tree in the area and sat with his rifle across his knees. Then he waited. At around 11 p.m., his patience paid off. He heard the sound of rustling nearby. His instincts told him that this was the bear he had been searching for. But instead of going after it, Kenneth waited for about an hour in the darkness, still sitting at the base of that tree, hardly daring to move. At last, he heard the sound coming closer. In the dim moonlight, Kenneth could just make out the shape of something moving. Slowly, he reached for his flashlight and held it out in front of him. Then he switched it on. Directly in its beam, he saw it. Startled, the creature who had killed so many people rose up on its hind legs. Kenneth didn't hesitate. He drew his rifle and fired at the bear's exposed chest. All it took was one hit, and the nightmare of Mysore was finally put to an end. By the time of its death, the bear had attacked over 36 people, killing 12, including a lamb's son and Thima, and severely injuring others. Many of his victims had serious injuries to their face, and many of them lost at least one, if not both, of their eyes. Now, though, the terrified villagers could rest a bit easier at night. The case of the sloth bear of Mysore, tragic as it was, shed light onto the behavior of these creatures. Usually, sloth bears are herbivores. The fact that it not only attacked multiple people, but also consumed several individuals, upended our understanding of its species. The behavior was so unusual, in fact, that traditional scientific theories came up empty. As a result, people were left to form their own ideas of what could have caused this horrific rampage. One story claims that the bear was actually a female and that hunters had killed her cubs. All of the attacks then had been her enacting revenge on the villagers. Another said that the bear had fallen in love with a girl from one of the villages and had at one point even kidnapped her and taken her back to its lair. Hunters had then come and freed the girl, taking her back home, triggering a rampage that would leave so many people dead and many more injured. Because no autopsy was performed, the true reason will forever remain a mystery. Kenneth Anderson would go on to live a full life, but he never forgot his encounter with the man-eater of Mysore, or when he came so close to death on the path to end its reign of terror.